Hello folks, tonight we drift into the mists and fog of the far north, where winds whistle through pine forests and waves slap cold against jagged stone. You're bundled under blankets, eyelids heavy, and out there, on the cold shores of Norway, something stirs. A curved hull, rising out of the mist like a dragon's spine. Somewhere in a forest clearing, a grave has been dug not for a body, but for a ship. And inside, warriors, goods, and dreams of the afterlife are folded together like an oak-scented sandwich. And yes, this is your reminder that a bedtime story about raiders and conquerors can still make you feel sleepy. Go figure. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy to be here. Drop a comment with your location and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe open a window for that soft wind blow, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. They weren't born Vikings. That word comes later. But what we call Vikings grew from the cold bones of Scandinavia, specifically the long and craggy coastline of what's now Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. Picture this: towering cliffs, icy waterfalls, and deep, dark fjords carved by glaciers that left just enough flat land to make farming a nightmare. So what do you do when you can't grow many crops? You look to the sea, and you build ships. Before swords, before raids, before all the screaming and burning and pillaging, they were sailors. Not because it was romantic, but because the alternative was starving on a mossy hillside. Evidence from as early as the 7th century CE shows seafaring routes already deep in Scandinavian culture. One beautiful site in Salme, Estonia, dating to around 650 CE, reveals a remarkable grave. 2 ships stacked with warriors, animals, weapons, and the first hints of a life spent dancing across the waves. Scientists still debate whether this was a raid gone wrong or a ritual crossing, but the ships speak loudest. They were meant for both war and afterlife. You'll notice something strange when archaeologists start uncovering Norse graves. The ships are everywhere. Some are buried whole, like the one found in Oseberg in Norway. Others are marked out in stones, ship settings, traced like chalk outlines of vanished vessels. These weren't mere transportation. They were spiritual symbols designed to carry souls to Valhalla, or simply to say, this person, yeah, they mattered. Picture it. You're walking through the mist, and in the grass lies the ghost of a ship, etched in standing stones, open to the sky. And those fjords, they're not just postcard pretty, they're strategic marvels. Like watery highways, they protected villages while giving seafarers easy access to open ocean. Add a few shallow straits and sneaky inlets, and you've got yourself the perfect launch pad for a 1,000-year-long party, with axes. But again, let's not rush into the raiding. Back then, in the early days, a lot of what the Norse did was trade. Furs, amber, walrus ivory. Items so rare and exotic, they might as well have been unicorn toenails to the people further south. They traded with the Franks, the Slavs, the Irish, even the Arab world. Some Viking burial sites contain silk from the east and coins from Baghdad. That's like finding a Rolex in a squirrel's nest. And before the longships prowled west to the British Isles or east to Russia, they prowled closer to home. Coastal raids in the Baltics, fishing expeditions, exploration of archipelagos that seemed like floating stepping stones. These early movements were smaller, more experimental. Think of them like pirate training wheels. One quirky note: even in these early days, Viking ships were designed with enough flexibility to be dragged over land when needed. Yup. Imagine dragging a 30-foot boat like a sled over a forest floor, grumbling all the way while someone insists this is definitely the faster route. It's an engineering choice so baffling it actually worked. Now, archaeologists and historians still argue whether the people who built these ships and made these graves saw themselves as part of a Norse culture yet, or just regional farmers with a flair for woodworking. But there's one thing no one questions. By the mid-600s CE, the seeds of something wilder had already been planted. Let's not forget how spiritual this early world was too. These were not atheist pragmatists with sea salt in their beards. These were people who believed in sea spirits, land wights, and gods who literally rode chariots across the sky. When you lived in a landscape that tried to kill you 9 months of the year, the weather had to be personal. So when they buried their dead in ships or built enormous burial mounds, it wasn't just tradition, it was insurance. Here lies Eirik, who fought bravely and loved salted cod. We gave him his ship so he can sail beyond the mist. Also, please don't haunt us. And finally, as night falls across that ancient landscape, imagine one last sensory moment. You're in the pine-dark woods of Scandinavia. Somewhere, a ship is being carved from oak. Someone hammers at planks with a stone tool. The smell of tar, wood smoke, and salted fish fills the air, and you can almost hear the whisper of the ocean calling them to leave the shore behind. They don't know it yet, but the world will soon know their name. What is a Viking anyway? That's not the start of a pub quiz. It's a real academic headache. Because for all the horns and beards imagery that floods our modern brains, the term Viking wasn't originally a job description, nationality, or even a particularly flattering label. It was more like a verb. To go Viking in Old Norse, fara I Viking, meant to go out on an expedition, often one involving raiding, trading, exploring, or just generally seeing what you could get away with in someone else's territory. Sort of like saying, we're road tripping, but with more axes. The people who went on these expeditions might have been Norwegian, Danish, Swedish, or from somewhere blurrier. Regional borders were squishier than a wet bog shoe. But when they set sail, they became something else. Sea wolves with a flexible moral compass and a decent grasp of tides. Modern historians still wrestle with whether Viking was ever a cultural identity at the time. There was no Viking Empire, no king of the Vikings, no passport that said Viking land. Most likely, it was a phase, something young men did before settling down, or dying horribly. The lifestyle equivalent of a gap year, but with fewer hostels and more longships. And speaking of longships, don't worry, we'll get to those marvels soon. But back to the point. There's a tendency in movies and memes to lump all Norse folk from 700 to 1100 CE into one axe-wielding tribe. In reality, most were just farmers who happened to own a decent sword and could navigate by the stars. It's like assuming everyone in medieval Europe was a knight, or that every Italian has a Vespa and a pizza oven. Some did, most didn't. Still, language matters. And the word Viking crept into Old English as early as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, where it was generally used with a tone of exhausted frustration. You know, Vikings showed up again, burned the abbey, stole everything not nailed down, yada yada. The term stuck, and centuries later it got polished into something grander. But wait, if Viking was an action, what about the ones who didn't raid? That's where the whole raiders versus traders debate flares up like a Norse rash. Some academics argue the real engine of Viking expansion wasn't looting monasteries, but long-distance trade. Silver flowed from the Arab world, walrus ivory came from Greenland, and enslaved people were captured, traded, and shipped in networks that would make any modern logistics company wince. Others insist that violence was at the heart of it all. The raids weren't accidental, they were strategic, ritualistic, and often glorified. Raiding made reputations. It carved legends. It also funded farms back home. After all, what's the point of grabbing sacks of Frankish coin if you can't retire and build the biggest longhouse on the fjord? One fun tidbit. Some Viking warriors had nicknames like Skullsplitter, Beardless, or Halfdan the Black. But there's also Ivar the Boneless, a name so mysterious scholars still don't know if it referred to a medical condition, a snake-like fighting style, or just the fact that he could limbo under anything. Also, quick historical snack. There's zero archaeological evidence that Vikings wore horned helmets. None. Zero. Zilch. That image was cooked up in the 1800s by opera designers who apparently thought, let's make them look extra stabby. Actual Viking helmets, on the rare occasions we find them, were more practical, rounded, sometimes with a nose guard, and never accessorized like a Viking Halloween costume. Sorry, cosplay fans. Back to the names and identities. Many Norse folk didn't think of themselves in tribal blocks like Danes or Swedes. More often, it was about who your local jarl was, or what valley you called home. Kinship mattered more than kinghood. A man from Gotland might feud with a guy from Hedeby without either realizing they shared the same gods, drinking habits, and tragic love of fermented fish. And then there were the women. The whole Viking warrior princess thing has recently come under scrutiny. There are graves, famously one in Birka, Sweden, that contain high-status weapons alongside female remains, which ignited a firestorm of debate. Some argue this proves female warriors were real. Others caution that we can't assume someone was a fighter just because their grave goods were cool. As usual, historians remain politely at odds, like neighbors arguing over hedge height, but with more footnotes. Still, women in Viking society wielded power in different ways, through inheritance, land rights, and even divorce. A woman who held the household keys wasn't just running the kitchen, she ran the farm, the finances, and possibly the family sword stash. Think Norse Matilda from accounting, but with sheep and a bow. One more curious thing about the whole going Viking concept. It was often seasonal. Spring to late summer was raiding season, while autumn meant heading home to harvest, tend livestock, and prep for the long, dark winter. Yes, even marauders had a work-life balance. And so, as the night stretches longer over the North Sea, and the stars drift above the curved prows of their ships, we start to understand. Viking wasn't a badge. It was a choice, a way of moving through the world, sometimes violently, sometimes commercially, often both, but always guided by tides, steel, and a nose for opportunity. And as we ease gently into the next chapter, the wood is creaking, the wind is rising, and someone's about to invent a boat that will change everything. The boat, the longship. Or if you're in the mood for Old Norse, the langskip. These weren't just vessels, they were characters in the Viking story. Sleek, fast, terrifying in silhouette, and capable of slipping up rivers like a ghost in the reeds. Honestly, if ships had Tinder profiles, the Viking longship would be left swiped out of sheer intimidation. But how did they pull it off? We're talking 1,000 years ago. No metal hulls, no rivets, no fancy blueprints. Just wood, sweat, and something called clinker construction. It's a method of overlapping wooden planks like fish scales, each one slightly over the next, fastened with iron rivets and sealed with tar-soaked wool or animal hair. The result? Flexibility. The hull could bend with the waves instead of shattering. If you've ever tried building a Lego boat and had it break in the tub, imagine the opposite. These ships were practically alive. They used oak when they could. Tough, not resistant, and ridiculously durable. Shipbuilders would mirror cut the wood, following the grain so precisely it was like carving poetry into timber. It took years to train a shipwright. And when that final nail was hammered and the keel kissed water for the first time, it was a spiritual moment, often blessed with offerings or blood. Yes, sometimes animal, occasionally not. Historians still argue over just how early Viking sails came into play. Some say the earliest ships used only oars, and that sails were added later, around the 700s CE. But by the time the raids began in full force, sails were standard, made from wool, reinforced with leather, and dyed in stripes or patterns to intimidate the daylights out of your enemies. Imagine a 30-meter-long ship gliding silently across the water, its square sail billowing like the cloak of some sea god, filled with the breath of angry winds and worse intentions. Fun fact, Viking ships weren't all the same. The Kave was smaller, good for cargo or family trips. Yes, family road trips by sea, minus the gas station snacks. The Nar was the heavy-duty freighter, but the Drakkar, the dragon ship, was the showstopper. Carved prow like a beast's head, shields lined along the sides, and a shallow draft that let it sneak into rivers, land on beaches, and exit before you could say, "Who left the church door unlocked?" And they didn't just sail west. Viking ships cut across the Baltic, ploughed up Russian rivers, and made it all the way to Constantinople and Baghdad. Archaeological finds prove it. Viking nails, anchors, and coins show up in places no Scandinavian should reasonably have been. It's as if they glanced at a map and thought, sure, we can get there. Probably. Speaking of proof, let's talk about the Oseberg ship. Discovered in a burial mound in 1904 near Tønsberg, Norway, this ship wasn't built for war, but for honor. A royal grave for two women of high status, laid to rest with a cart, tapestries, buckets carved from wood, sleighs, yes, multiple, and even some sacrificed animals. The ship itself, beautifully preserved. Over 70 feet long, with intricate carvings on the prow, including entwined animals that seem to writhe in the wood even 1,000 years later. If ships could have souls, this one was already halfway to Valhalla. The Oseberg is more than an artifact. It's a cultural time capsule. It shows us craftsmanship, ceremony, and the way the Norse blurred lines between the practical and the divine. When you bury someone in a ship, you're not just sending them off, you're launching them. Another major ship find, the Roskilde warships in Denmark. 5 wrecked vessels sunk deliberately to block a fjord entrance, now carefully preserved and displayed. These range from swift raiders to cargo haulers, and they've taught archaeologists a ton about Viking naval variety. Plus, watching modern replicas like the Saga Oseberg set sail gives us goosebumps, especially when they silently slice through the water like they're searching for a monastery to lightly inconvenience. Now, these ships weren't luxurious. No cabins, no creature comforts, just benches, rigging, maybe a tent if it rained. But for all that minimalism, they were revolutionary. Lightweight enough to portage across land, remember those ship drags, but strong enough to weather ocean gales. With a good wind and determined crew, a Viking longship could hit 10-15 knots. That's around 11 to 17 mph. Fast enough to overtake most coastal defenses, and definitely fast enough to leave before anyone had time to gather pitchforks. Here's a quirky image. Some raids started before dawn. Imagine waking up to the sound of creaking oars and shouting in a language you don't understand. You rush outside and boom, there's a ship floating just offshore, dragonhead glinting in the morning sun, sails dropped, warriors wading through surf like it's a casual beach day. Except this beach day ends with someone stealing your sheep and setting your roof on fire. But even for the Norse, these ships weren't invincible. The sea giveth and taketh. Storms sank ships. Ice trapped them. And on occasion, yes, defenders learned to push back, trapping Viking ships in estuaries or burning them while moored. But more often than not, the longship gave the Norse a winning edge in surprise, speed, and psychological warfare. Sailors today still marvel at the balance and engineering of these boats. Their long, narrow frames reduced drag. Their symmetrical ends meant they could reverse course without turning, just row the other way. And that's not even mentioning how some had removable rudders, collapsible masts, and cargo space sneakier than your uncle's fishing cooler. Ultimately, it was the ship that made the Viking. Not the sword, not the beard, not the brooding. The ship was the real star. And as you drift gently now through waves of dreams, imagine a cold wind against your face, the rhythmic creak of oars, the hiss of sails unfurling, and the distant glint of a monastery dome. Oh, sorry, did we say monastery? We meant destination. Let's linger a moment on what they carried inside those sleek ships. Not cargo, not food, not your cousin's sheep. We're talking weapons, tools of terror and trade, sometimes both at once, because whether a Viking came in peace or to pillage, you could bet your bottom dirham. He wasn't showing up unarmed. The standard toolkit, sword, axe, spear, and shield. It was like the Norse version of rock, paper, scissors, but bloodier and less friendly at parties. The most coveted, the sword. And not just any sword. We're talking about the mythical Ulfbert. Now, this wasn't a model number, it was a maker's mark, etched right into the blade in elegant Latin script, Pu Ulfbert Plus. Over 170 of these swords have been found across Europe, forged from a higher quality steel than what was typical at the time. Some experts argue these were the Viking version of a Rolex. High status, crazy expensive, and often faked. That's right, knockoff Ulfberts existed, made with inferior metal but mimicking the engraving. Vikings were ahead of the curve on designer piracy, but not everyone could afford a sword. Axes were cheaper, more versatile, and just as deadly. Your average Norse farmer could be tending crops in the morning and splitting skulls in the afternoon with the same tool. And don't picture some lumberjack monstrosity. Viking axes were slim, light, often single-handed, and wickedly sharp. Some had extended beards, curved lower blades that let you hook a shield or pull a foe close. Intimate, in the worst way. Then there were spears, the quiet overachievers of Viking armament. Easy to make, easy to throw, easy to plant dramatically into the ground before battle. In Norse mythology, even Odin himself wielded a magical spear named Gungnir. So yes, if you were feeling stylish but practical, the spear had you covered. Now, defense. The classic round shield, made of linden wood, may be covered in leather, rimmed with iron. Often painted in vivid colors or with symbols, these shields weren't just defensive, they were psychological. Line up 40 warriors, all holding circular shields tight together, and you get a shield wall. A moving, groaning wooden tank. It could repel arrows, push against enemy lines, and serve as a mobile drum set if everyone started banging in rhythm. But the real pièce de resistance? The hog's snout formation, or svinfylking. Imagine a wedge, pointed, narrow, with the leader at the tip, designed to punch through enemy lines like a tusk through mud. Historians still argue about how often it was used, and whether it was more ceremonial than practical. But if you were on the wrong side of it, you probably didn't stick around to check. And what about armor? Contrary to video game imagery, full metal suits were rare. A rich warrior might have a mail shirt, called a byrnie, made of thousands of interlocking rings. Helmets, when worn, were simple domes, sometimes with nose guards, no horns. Let's repeat that for the folks in the back. No horns. Quirky side note. One Icelandic saga tells of berserkers, warriors who fought in a trance-like fury, wore animal pelts, and supposedly felt no pain. Whether these berserkers were real, drugged, or simply great at marketing is still up for debate. Some think mushrooms were involved. Others suggest ritual hypnosis. Either way, not the kind of guy you wanted as your neighbor or your wedding guest. And where's our proof? Archaeological finds speak louder than sagas. Take the Salme ship burial in Estonia, dated to around 650 CE. Dozens of skeletons were found with battle injuries, deep sword wounds, slashes to the skull, and one man who seemed to have a spear embedded in his spine. A tidy little gift from the afterlife. 2 ships, noble gear, and even gaming pieces were buried there. Historians still debate whether this was a raid gone wrong or a glorious send-off. Another grim clue, the mass graves at Repton, England. Here, remains of Viking warriors were discovered, some with cut marks on bones, signs of violent death. Many were young men, stacked like logs in a crypt that had once been sacred. Whether they died in conquest or were victims of disease and siege is still discussed in tweed-filled university halls. And for those of us living in less gruesome times, reenactments now help us understand Norse warfare. In Wollin, Poland, there's an annual Viking festival where modern enthusiasts don mail, grab axes, and stage mock battles. It's a blend of history and cosplay, minus the blood. But it gives us a sense of what combat might have felt like, minus the sheer terror of, well, actually dying. But Viking weapons weren't just about war, they were also currency. A fine sword could be gifted to seal an alliance. A decorated axe might show loyalty to a jarl, and some weapons were buried with their owners, snapped in half or twisted, ritually killed, so the dead wouldn't get too cocky in the afterlife. We also have stories of duels to settle disputes, and of weapons passed down through generations, almost like family pets, except more lethal and less cuddly. A man's sword had a name, a story, a reputation. Losing it in battle was disgraceful. Finding it again, legendary. As you settle deeper into sleep, imagine standing on a foggy plain. Around you, warriors tighten their shield wall. Breath clouds the air. Somewhere nearby, someone mutters a prayer to Thor. Then silence, broken only by the thump of advancing boots and the creak of wood. Not all Vikings were warriors, but when they were, they made sure everyone remembered. The Norse world was not just about raids, plunder, and the occasional awkward boat burial. Beneath the steel and sails, there was a deep, earthy layer of belief. A myth-soaked, ritual-rich tapestry of gods, monsters, and sacrifices that connected everyday life to something bigger, older, and just a little terrifying. So, snuggle in, and let's wander into the sacred shadows of the Viking imagination. At the top of the divine food chain stood Odin, the one-eyed god of wisdom, war, and poetry. Picture an old man with a beard, draped in a cloak, wandering the 9 worlds in search of knowledge. He once hung himself from a tree for 9 days to learn the secrets of runes. Self-care looked a little different back then. And don't forget, he traded one of his eyes for a sip from Mimir as well, because why not swap vision for enlightenment? Priorities. Then came Thor. You know him, you love him, or at least your local cinema does. But forget the Hollywood biceps for a moment. Real Norse Thor was a rough-and-tumble protector of mankind, wielding his hammer, Mjolnir, to battle frost giants and keep cosmic chaos at bay. Farmers prayed to him for good weather. Warriors prayed to him for victory. And blacksmiths, well, they probably just appreciated the hammer content. And then there's Loki, trickster, shapeshifter, chaos goblin. Sometimes a helper, more often a headache. Loki's stories range from hilarious to horrifying. He fathered a wolf, mothered a horse, don't ask, and once got tied up with the entrails of his own son. Academic debates swirl around Loki like storm clouds. Was he evil, misunderstood, or just the Norse embodiment of let's see what happens? Now, all these gods lived in Asgard, connected to our world, Midgard, by a flaming rainbow bridge called Bifrost. Not subtle, but definitely stylish. The Norse cosmos was structured around 9 realms, including icy Niflheim and fiery Muspelheim, kind of like a cosmic apartment block with very strange neighbors. When a Viking died, their destination in the afterlife depended on how they lived, or more precisely, how they died. Valhalla, the Hall of the Slain, was Odin's elite afterlife, reserved for those who died in battle. There, fallen warriors fought all day and feasted all night, waking each morning to do it all again. An eternal cycle of combat and mead, which honestly sounds like the world's most intense summer camp. But not everyone ended up in Valhalla. Freya, goddess of love and war, had her own hall, Folkvanga, where she claimed half the battle dead. Others might end up in Hell, a more neutral, shadowy realm ruled by, wait for it, Hel, Loki's daughter. It wasn't exactly hellish despite the name, more like a cold waiting room with a cosmic shrug. Now let's talk about how the Norse said goodbye to their dead. You've probably heard of ship burials, right? A noble Viking might be laid to rest in their vessel, surrounded by grave goods, swords, tools, food, even animals or servants. Sometimes the ship was buried under a mound. Sometimes, in the more dramatic send-offs, it was set aflame and pushed out to sea. The truth? The flaming funeral ship is more Hollywood than history. Archaeological evidence for those is slim. But don't let facts get in the way of a good visual. Then, there were bog offerings. Sacred things, sometimes human, were thrown into wetlands, believed to be gateways to the gods. Take the Tolland man, for example, found in a Danish bog, so perfectly preserved that he looks like he just took a nap mid-ritual. Scientists still debate whether these sacrifices were volunteers, criminals, or something in between. And again, the tweed-wearing crowd of scholars loves to argue about it. Many Viking sacred sites were outdoor altars, usually in groves or by stones. The Norse didn't do temples like the Greeks or Romans. Their worship was tied to the land, mountains, lakes, forests. You didn't need a building to call the gods. You needed a fire, a song, and maybe a chicken. Or, if you were feeling ambitious, a horse, possibly a person. Yes, human sacrifice was part of some rituals, especially during times of crisis, like famine or war. Arab traveller Ibn Fadlan famously described a funeral where a slave girl volunteered to join her master in death, complete with a ritual that was, let's say, not for the faint of heart. Was he exaggerating? Maybe. Scholars still debate the accuracy of his account, but it fits with sagas and other sources that hint at grisly rites. Still, it wasn't all blood and chanting. The Norse also had festivals, feasts, and storytelling traditions that were downright cozy. Blots were sacrificial celebrations where animals were offered and beer flowed like, well, beer. Community mattered. Honor mattered. And so did sharing tales around a roaring fire while snow tapped gently on the longhouse roof. By the late 10th century, though, the pressure was mounting. Christian missionaries were arriving, and the Norse gods were starting to feel the chill. The conversion to Christianity wasn't instant or even smooth. Take King Olaf Tryggvason, who is said to have converted people by sword. As in, get baptized or lose your head. Cozy, right? Some kings resisted. Some embraced the new faith for political reasons. And many common folks just layered new beliefs on top of old ones. A carved cross might sit beside a hammer pendant. Churches were built over old sacred sites. It was less a clean break, more a theological game of Jenga. But even as the gods faded, their stories endured. The poetic Edda and prose Edda, written down in Iceland after conversion, preserved the myths in ink. Scholars owe a huge thank you to those scribes. Without them, we'd know far less about Thor's goat-powered chariot or the time Loki turned into a mare. Again, don't ask. As the fire crackles low and sleep draws near, imagine a world lit by torchlight, where the line between myth and memory blurs, where gods walk among mortals, and a raven in the trees might be Odin himself, watching, waiting, remembering. And then, almost like a thunderclap in the night, the Vikings made themselves known to the wider world, not with polite letters or embroidered maps, but with raids, fast, brutal, and terrifying. It was less hello neighbor, and more, here's your monastery, now it's on fire. The year was 793 CE. A quiet monastery perched on Lindisfarne, a holy island off the northeast coast of England, went about its daily prayers. Monks copied manuscripts, lit candles, probably sang a few haunting chants, and then bam, the sea delivered something very different than fish that morning. Longships scraped up the shore, warriors spilled out, and within hours the sacred site was looted, burned, and bloodied. To the Christian world, it was the apocalypse with a north wind. In reality, it wasn't the first Viking raid, but it was the most infamous. Why hit a monastery? Because monasteries were the medieval equivalent of a bank, poorly guarded, full of shiny things, and the residents didn't exactly fight back. Smart, if you set aside the whole horrifying everyone angle. From there, the pace quickened. Over the next few decades, Viking raids became a terrifying seasonal event along the coasts of Britain, Ireland, and Francia. These weren't full invasions, just surgical strikes. Sail in, smash things, grab gold, maybe take a few prisoners to sell, then sail off into the mist. And they didn't stop at churches. Trade towns like Kaupang, one of Norway's earliest urban centres, became key targets and launchpads. Whoever controlled Kaupang controlled commerce. The Vikings weren't just raiders. They were business-savvy raiders, like pirates with spreadsheets. But why now? What made the 8th and 9th centuries ripe for Viking mayhem? First, there was the expansion of Charlemagne's empire. His aggressive Christian campaigns stirred up resentment in the north. Imagine you're a Norse chieftain, hearing rumours that some emperor down south is forcing baptisms and burning sacred groves. That doesn't exactly inspire peaceful coexistence. Second, Europe was fragmented. Kingdoms were numerous, disjointed, and often squabbling among themselves. Perfect for opportunists with fast ships and sharp steel. And let's not forget the Danegeld, literally Dane money. It was a protection payment. Vikings would raid, then offer not to return, for a fee. Some kings paid handsomely, others regretted it. Historians still debate whether Danegeld prevented more violence or simply invited bigger shopping lists. The hit-and-run tactic was their signature. A longship would slip up a river or coastline, unload warriors, and hit targets before the locals even knew what was happening. Speed was everything. Some raids were over in minutes, others dragged into days. But either way, the attackers were ghosts, there and gone before resistance could organize. Eventually, the Vikings moved from coastal raids to semi-permanent bases. These weren't just camps, they were fortified outposts, built near strategic waterways. Think of Repton again, or Dublin in Ireland, which started as a Viking settlement. From these hubs, they could stage bigger raids, overwinter, and trade their loot, or slaves, with local markets. It was organized chaos. A quirky detail: in Ireland, some monks actually built round towers, tall stone columns with tiny windows and elevated doors. These weren't fancy watchtowers. They were Viking panic rooms, where monks could grab their manuscripts and scramble up ladders to wait out the storm. Whether they worked depends on how hungry the raiders were. By the mid-800s, the Viking presence wasn't just a coastal annoyance. It was a constant threat. Towns fortified their walls. Priests worked overtime to pray away the next wave. The phrase, "From the fury of the Northmen, O Lord, deliver us," started popping up in Latin prayers. A little dramatic, maybe. But when your evening ends with your town on fire, you get poetic. Yet not all raids were bloodbaths. Some Vikings took a more negotiable approach. They'd show up, flex a little, and demand tribute without violence. It was less about fighting and more about intimidation. If you've ever paid a late fee to avoid an argument at the library, you understand the model. One underrated factor in all this: weather. The medieval warm period provided slightly milder temperatures, making sailing conditions more favorable. Add that to advanced shipbuilding and a society itching to expand, and you've got a recipe for very busy coastlines. Still, historians argue over the motivation. Was it overpopulation back home? Political exile? Ambition? Or just good old-fashioned wanderlust wrapped in fur and steel? The truth likely includes a mix. Some were exiles, some were glory seekers. Others just wanted land, silver, or a story to tell around the fire. Whatever the cause, the impact was seismic. Viking raids didn't just rattle a few coastal villages, they reshaped medieval Europe. They exposed weaknesses in feudal defenses, led to the development of early warning systems, like fire beacons, and eventually to alliances between former enemies. Also, let's not forget language. Thanks to Viking settlement and influence, English today is sprinkled with Old Norse. Words like sky, egg, window, knife, and berserk. Every time you complain about your window not closing right, you're echoing a Viking legacy. A little domestic, but still. So, as you lie there with blankets tucked tight and the distant howl of wind outside, imagine a torchlit ship slipping quietly into a harbour. No horns, no fanfare, just quiet determination, a splash of seawater, and the whisper of boots on sand. The first true Viking storm was just beginning, but if the raids were sparks, the Viking push eastward was a wildfire, quiet, far-reaching, and surprisingly sophisticated. As much as we picture Norsemen as wild seafarers of the North Atlantic, many of them turned their gaze inland, navigating deep into the heart of what is now Russia, Ukraine, and beyond. And they didn't just loot, they traded, settled, ruled, and in some cases became entirely new peoples. Let's drift into the soft-flowing current of the rivers of silver. Imagine a Viking longship gliding not across stormy seas, but down wide, slow rivers. The Neva, the Volga, the Dnieper. Dense forests crowd the banks. Mist curls above the water. Instead of coastal raids, the goals here were markets, alliances, and access to the golden heart of Byzantium and the rich East. Because sometimes a helmet wasn't for battle, it was for business. The earliest known Norse foothold in the East was at Sturaya Ladoga, founded around the mid-8th century near the Gulf of Finland. The name sounds like a fantasy kingdom, and honestly, it kind of was. Archaeologists have found Scandinavian-style graves, jewelry, and weaponry, mixed in with Slavic and Finnic artifacts. A melting pot of cultures, long before the word multicultural got trendy. From there, the Norse, called Varangians, or sometimes simply Russ, followed river routes that connected the Baltic Sea to the Black and Caspian Seas. Their ships, built light and strong, could be portaged, that is, dragged overland between rivers. It wasn't easy, but when silver and silk lay on the other side, a little boat hauling was a fair price. They reached Novgorod, then Kiev, founding what many consider the early foundations of Kievan Russes, a federation of Slavic and Norse peoples. And here's where it gets spicy. Scholars still debate the origin of the name Russia. Is it from the Russ, those Norse traders, or a Slavic evolution of local words? The arguments get heated in an academic, footnote-laden kind of way. What isn't disputed is the vastness of their trade. Viking merchants connected the North Sea to the Silk Road. They traded furs, walrus ivory, honey, and yes, people. Slaves, known as thralls, were a tragic but valuable commodity. In return, they received Islamic silver dirhams, silks, glassware, and spices. If you're picturing a long-haired man in a fur cloak paying for cinnamon with a pouch of coins stamped in Arabic, you're not far off. And oh, the dirhams. These small silver coins show up in Norse graves and hoards all over Scandinavia, sometimes drilled to be worn as jewelry, other times buried in clay pots under floorboards. Entire economies back home ran on this foreign silver. One coin even carried the inscription, "There is no God but Allah." It's unlikely many Vikings converted, but they weren't picky about whose god was on their money, as long as it could buy things. Now, let's pause for a delightfully odd tidbit. In some regions, archaeologists have found mock coins, locally made copies of Islamic dirhams, sometimes made from lead. Why? Possibly to trick traders, possibly to use as decorative items, or perhaps to stash as symbolic wealth. It's like printing monopoly money, but still trying to buy a goat with it. And as trade blossomed, so did relationships with other powers. The Byzantines were both wary and fascinated by these rugged northerners. The Varangian Guard, the emperor's elite bodyguards, were famously made up of Norse warriors. Imagine a broad-shouldered man from Sweden, clad in chainmail, standing solemn watch over the glittering mosaics of Constantinople. The contrast is almost poetic. Some Vikings settled permanently in the east. Intermarriage was common. Graves reveal blending customs, Slavic pottery beside Norse swords, Christian crosses alongside Thor's hammers. Culture here wasn't a wall, it was a braided rope, but not everything was smooth sailing. The journey down rivers like the Dnieper wasn't just long, it was dangerous. There were rapids, bandits, and feuding tribes. Arab geographer al-Masudi wrote of these Norse traders bathing in rivers together, covered in tattoos from fingernails to neck, armed to the teeth. He seemed both horrified and impressed, basically the default reaction to Vikings. One particularly treacherous spot was the Dnieper Rapids, where merchants had to disassemble their ships, carry them past dangerous waters, and reassemble them on the other side. It was a long and risky process, but the reward, access to the Black Sea and Constantinople, made it worth it. This wasn't chaos, it was logistical genius, fueled by ambition and the promise of exotic wares. And then, of course, came religion. As the Russes settled and built power bases, some adopted Orthodox Christianity. The conversion of Vladimir the Great in 988 CE marked a turning point, signalling deeper ties with Byzantium and a shift away from the old Norse gods. The echoes of Odin were fading, replaced by the bells of the Eastern Church. But even after Christianity arrived, traces of old ways lingered. A Thor's hammer might still hang beneath a new cross. Burial mounds continued, though with fewer sacrificed horses. It was a slow transition, not a hard line. Today, The legacy of the Eastern Vikings remains tangled in the roots of Russian, Ukrainian, and Belarusian identity. Some modern nationalists argue about just how foreign those Norse rulers were. Were they colonizers or founders? Invaders or unifiers? Historians still argue, and they likely will for years to come. So picture this before you drift off. A longship moving silently through a moonlit river, its wake rippling silver under starlight. On board, furs bundled for trade, silver coins clinking softly. A quiet warrior watching the tree line for signs of life. No battle cry, no raid, just trade, transformation, and the gentle hush of water on wood. While silver flowed in from the east, another tide surged westward. Only this one was red with ambition and soaked in conquest. The Western Viking fury wasn't just about raiding anymore. By the mid-9th century, Viking leaders began trading in quick-hit strikes for something longer-lasting: settlement. They were done looting churches. Now they wanted kingdoms. The scale changed dramatically. Instead of a few ships creeping along the coast, entire fleets now crossed the North Sea. And at the head of this change stood the infamous Great Heathen Army. Sounds like something from a heavy metal album, doesn't it? In reality, it was one of the most coordinated Viking military campaigns ever launched. Landing in East Anglia in 865 CE, the army wasn't just out for silver. They came with wagons, women, and warbands. This wasn't a raid, it was colonization. Led by warrior chieftains like Ivar the Boneless, yes, really, and Halfdan Ragnarsson, the Great Heathen Army swept through Anglo-Saxon England like a storm. It wasn't just brute force either. They were strategic. They'd demand tribute from one king, use it to fund a tax on another, and then turn back around to collect more from the first. It was a circular economy with swords. First came York, seized in 866 CE and transformed into Jorvik, a Norse-controlled hub. From there, Viking rule spread across northeastern England, creating the so-called Danelaw, an area where Danish law held sway. Here, Norse language, customs, and even farming practices took root. And while the name sounds like a Viking-themed country club, the Danelaw was a genuine slice of Scandinavia carved out of England. Now, remember Alfred? Not the butler from Batman, Alfred the Great, King of Wessex. He was one of the few Anglo-Saxon rulers who actually pushed back successfully. After a string of defeats, he reorganized his military, built fortified towns known as burhs, and pioneered an early navy. Smart guy. Maybe not fun at parties, but great in a crisis. By 878 CE, Alfred had forced the Viking leader Guthrum to accept baptism and withdraw from Wessex territory. It wasn't a total win, but it was enough to keep southern England under Anglo-Saxon control. The boundaries between Viking and English zones were drawn, and they held, more or less, for decades. Meanwhile, across the Channel, something fascinating was brewing in northern Francia. You see, the Franks had the same Viking problem as the English. Coastal towns burned, silver vanished, and nobles lost sleep. Eventually, they tried a new strategy. If you can't beat the Vikings, hire them. Enter Rollo, a Norse leader whose name sounds oddly cuddly for someone who probably set fire to a lot of things. After years of raiding, Rollo struck a deal in 911 CE with Charles the Simple. Again, yes, really. In exchange for land along the Seine River and a pledge to defend it against other Vikings, Rollo got a duchy. And just like that, Normandy was born. Literally the land of the Northmen. Here's a quirky detail. As part of the deal, Rollo had to kiss the king's foot in submission. Legend says he refused, ordering one of his men to do it. That guy lifted the king's foot so abruptly, the poor monarch fell over backward. It's unclear if it really happened, but if it did, honestly, that's a pretty Viking way to fulfill a vow. Normandy became one of the most successful Viking settlements. The Norse gradually adopted the French language and Christian customs, but kept their warrior spirit. In just over a century, Rollo's great-great-great-grandson, William the Conqueror, would use that legacy to claim the English crown in 1066 CE. From raiders to rulers to royal lineage, that's some serious character development. Back in the British Isles, Viking settlements were changing the landscape. Towns like Dublin, Waterford, and Limerick in Ireland became bustling Norse trading ports. The Irish initially resisted fiercely. Monks don't exactly welcome axe-swinging house guests, but over time relationships blurred. Norse men married Irish women. Cultures blended. Even language swapped around. Irish sagas began to include Norse characters. One even tells of a Viking with a magic spear and a questionable attitude. Classic. By the 10th century, the West was a mosaic of Viking influence. From the Danelaw in England to the Duchy of Normandy to Norse-Irish hybrid cities. This wasn't just conquest, it was transformation. The Vikings didn't just impose their culture, they absorbed others and reshaped themselves along the way. And yet, historians still argue about how Viking these settlers remained. Were they Norse in name only, quickly domesticated by local customs? Or did they preserve a core identity, just dressed in new robes? Some graves show traditional Norse burial styles, with swords and ship imagery. Others look thoroughly Christian, with crosses and Latin inscriptions. The truth may lie somewhere in between, a kind of cultural layering that modern archaeologists are still peeling apart. One odd find: a Norse woman buried in England with a comb, beads, and a board game, likely Hnefatafl, a strategy game popular in Scandinavia. Even in death, she wanted to keep playing. Respect. As you settle deeper into your pillow, picture that woman's burial site. Calm, misty, maybe a raven perched nearby. The wind whispers through ancient trees. Beneath the soil, Norse and Anglo-Saxon legacies mingle like watercolors, blurring borders and reshaping futures. The fury of the Vikings had left its mark, but it wasn't finished yet. As Viking power spread through the British Isles and across the rivers of Eastern Europe, daily life in the Norse world went on, quietly and steadily, far from the clang of swords and splash of oars. Let's leave the battlefield behind for a moment. Let the axe hang on its peg and walk into the home of a Viking farmer. Don't worry, no need to knock. Just watch your head on the low beam. A typical Norse settlement wasn't a fortress or a war camp. It was a practical, often cozy cluster of longhouses, animal pens, and storage huts. These were earthy, lived-in places where people didn't just survive. They thrived, farmed, and argued about goats. The Jarls ruled, the Bondi farmed, and the thralls, the enslaved class, did much of the hard labor, from hauling peat to churning butter. The longhouse was the heart of it all. Made from timber, sod, and wattle and daub, it often hosted an extended family of up to 20 people, plus livestock, who shared one end of the house, adding a certain aroma. Smoke drifted lazily from central hearth fires, curling through the air holes in the roof. Wooden beams were sometimes carved with simple knotwork, and personal items, combs, gaming pieces, tools, littered the living space. And yes, women played a pivotal role here. Viking women weren't shield maidens on the regular, though that legend has some intriguing roots, but they were managers of farms, holders of household keys, and owners of property. Keys were often buried with them, literal symbols of control over the homestead. Marriage contracts were business agreements, and divorce, totally a thing. If a husband embarrassed her at a feast or failed to provide, a woman could walk away. Respect. A fascinating burial in Denmark revealed a woman with imported silk, fine combs, and a metal staff, perhaps a vulva, a kind of seeress or spiritual guide. Historians still discuss whether these women held priestly power or social prestige, or both. Either way, she wasn't just someone's wife, she was a presence. Viking kids, meanwhile, had no iPads, tragic, but plenty to do. They helped on farms, played games like knucklebones, and likely learned to swim and row before they could read. Their toys, tiny ships, swords, and even carved animals. And while education wasn't standardized, some Norsemen could read and write using runes, a striking angular alphabet carved into wood, stone, and bone. Warning, not ideal for birthday cards. Now let's look outward. Beyond the farm, communities gathered at things. assemblies where disputes were aired, marriages arranged, laws passed, and gossip exchanged. The Althing in Iceland, founded in 930 CE, is often cited as one of the world's oldest surviving parliaments. Imagine a big outdoor debate club with sheep in the background and someone probably cooking fish over a smoky fire. Settlements like Birka in Sweden and Hedeby in Denmark weren't just villages. They were thriving trade towns, bustling with merchants, blacksmiths, leather workers, and travelers from as far as the Islamic world. These towns were the beating hearts of Viking commerce. Excavations at Hedeby have uncovered pottery from the Frankish Empire, beads from the Middle East, and even spices from Asia. That's quite a haul for people we keep labeling as barbarians. And they had laws, actual functioning legal codes. Theft, murder, property disputes, all handled through fines and family negotiations. Sure, blood feuds happened, and yes, they occasionally solved problems with swords, but most disputes were settled by compensation, usually in silver. There was even a complex system of values depending on who was killed. Accidentally slay a jarl. Hope your wallet's heavy. But here's a quirky footnote. In Iceland, some laws were memorized and recited out loud by a designated law speaker. His job was to keep the legal code alive, one word at a time, since writing laws down wasn't initially common. That's a lot of pressure. Forget one clause, and suddenly someone's getting fined for cow theft in the wrong century. Despite the rough edges, Norse life could be surprisingly sophisticated. Tools for metalwork, textile production, and carpentry show high levels of craftsmanship. They wove intricate woolen fabrics, crafted pattern-welded swords, and built multi-room homes with insulation made from turf and birch bark. Not exactly IKEA, but definitely functional chic. Spiritual life was everywhere. Little carved figures of gods, amulets, and household shrines remind us that belief wasn't reserved for temples. Odin, Thor, and Freya watched over daily tasks and sacrifices, animal or symbolic, were made for a good harvest, a safe voyage, or just general luck. And while Viking religion was mostly oral, historians still debate whether sagas written centuries later accurately reflect beliefs of the 9th and 10th centuries, or if those tales were polished through Christian lenses. Let's not forget pets. Dogs were common, cats too, and even, brace yourself, domesticated falcons for hunting, a luxury mostly for elites. In one grave, a woman was buried with her cat and her comb. Honestly, same, but life wasn't all idyllic farm scenes and festive assemblies. Winters were harsh, disease was constant, and sometimes communities vanished overnight, from climate, conflict, or famine. Iceland's volcanic soil made survival precarious. Greenland's settlements, established later, would struggle for centuries and eventually disappear. You had to be hardy, resourceful, and a little lucky. So, as we peek into these earthy homes, the firelight flickering off polished bone tools and carved wooden spoons, try to picture the Viking world not just as raiders on a boat, but as people with recipes, bedtime stories, family drama, and dreams. They loved, laughed, and likely complained about weather as much as we do. Minus the weather app. By now, the Norse world was no longer a patchwork of scattered clans and coastal farmers. It was a rising constellation of kingdoms, connected by sea, kinship, and ambition. And at the heart of this new phase stood men whose names still echo across Scandinavia and beyond. Harald Fairhair, Svein Forkbeard, and Canute the Great. This is where the Viking Age turns imperial, and the stakes grow higher. Let's begin with Harald Fairhair, the man credited with unifying Norway. According to the sagas, he vowed not to cut his hair until he had conquered all of Norway, which is bold, a little dramatic, and also very itchy. But he followed through. By the late 9th century, after a series of battles and strategic marriages, Harald declared himself king of a united Norway, ruling from a seat near Trondheim. That said, historians still debate the accuracy of this tidy narrative. Was Harald really the first unifier, or just the most memorable? Did he control the entire country, or just key regions? The record is cloudy, but what's clear is that Norway was becoming something bigger than a loose confederation of feuding jarls. Further south, Denmark was on the move. King Gorm the Old laid early foundations, but it was his son, Harald Bluetooth, yes, the guy your phone is named after, who Christianized the kingdom and claimed authority over parts of Norway and Germany. His runestone at Jelling boasts that he won all of Denmark and Norway and made the Danes Christian. That's quite the resume. And don't miss the symbolism. Bluetooth united Denmark, just as modern Bluetooth technology unites your headphones with embarrassing playlists. Coincidence? Probably. But it's fun. Harald's son, Svein Forkbeard, inherited that ambition with a fiercer edge. After a turbulent relationship with Dad, Svein may or may not have overthrown him. He set his sights on England, raiding, pillaging, and eventually forcing King Ethelred into exile. By 1013 CE, Svein was King of England, though his reign was short-lived. He died just a year later, mid-campaign. Timing, right? But the real imperial heavyweight was Canute the Great, Svein's son. And folks, Canute didn't just rule a kingdom, he ruled an empire. By 1028 CE, he was King of England, Denmark, Norway, and parts of Sweden. Imagine that. One ruler governing an empire that stretched from the Irish Sea to the Baltic. And he wasn't just a conqueror. He was a politician, a diplomat, and, dare we say it, a bit of a PR genius. He funded churches, supported Christian clergy, and even made a famous pilgrimage to Rome to show piety. A Viking emperor who knew how to market himself. Move over, TikTok influencers. Now, one of the best-known Canute tales is almost definitely apocryphal, but still delightful. It goes like this. Canute, tired of being flattered by courtiers who claimed he could do anything, had his throne carried to the seashore. There, he commanded the tide to halt. Of course it didn't. The waves rolled in and he soaked his royal shoes. Point made. Kings are still mortal, or wet. But while Canute's empire dazzled, it didn't last. His sons proved less capable, and after his death in 1035 CE, the North Sea Empire began to fracture. England reverted to native rule. Norway shook off Danish control, and the dream of a Scandinavian super-kingdom dissolved like sea foam on a beach. Still, the Norse legacy continued to grow elsewhere. In the east, the Rurikid dynasty took root. Named after Rurik, a semi-legendary Norse chieftain who supposedly founded the city of Novgorod in the 9th century, this dynasty became the royal house of Kievan Rus. That's right, the future of Russia had Viking DNA. The Rurikids didn't just govern. They blended Norse and Slavic traditions, built cities, and formed political alliances across Europe and Byzantium. Kiev became a major cultural hub, with glittering Orthodox churches and a thriving court. Some rulers even married into Byzantine royalty. One Rurikid princess, Anna of Kiev, would go on to become Queen of France. So much for barbarians, huh? Meanwhile, Poland was getting its own taste of the Viking world. The Bodzia graves, unearthed in modern-day Poland, contained a rich mix of Norse and Slavic burial practices. One man was buried with elite weapons, silk garments, and a silver belt. Some believe he was a mercenary or diplomat, someone who moved between worlds. Others argue he might have been a Norse chieftain integrated into Slavic society. Academics still scratch their heads over it. And in Iceland, settled peacefully by Norse migrants in the late 9th century, a unique society flourished. No kings, no castles, just an island of farmers, poets, and lawmakers. By the 10th century, Iceland was writing sagas, epic stories of love, feuds, and icy vengeance. They're part history, part mythology, and 100% dramatic. Think Game of Thrones, but with more sheep. The Althing, Iceland's national assembly, continued to govern through discussion and consensus. For centuries, the island remained fiercely independent, though eventually it too would come under foreign rule. So here we are. Viking power had reached its high tide. The seas they once ruled were now ringed with kingdoms and cities shaped by Norse hands. The raiders of Lindisfarne were now emperors, bishops, traders, and storytellers. They had sailed far from their wild beginnings, but time, as always, was moving on. Picture now the North Sea at dusk. Fading light catches on the wet hull of a ship moored at Hedeby. A fisherman casts his net. A child carves a dragon into driftwood. A longhouse door creaks open, firelight spilling out. The empire is quiet for now, but change is coming. As Viking rulers built kingdoms and carved their names into stones and chronicles, a different kind of tide began rising across the Norse world. Not one of conquest or silver, but of crosses, churches, and conversions. The Viking Age would not end with a final sword clash, but with a gradual surrender to Christianity, to new kings, and to time itself. This, friends, is where thunder gods met bishops, and the longhouses started quieting down. It all started slowly. For centuries, Norse beliefs had shaped life and death, from sacrifices in the bog to Odin's whispered bargains on the battlefield. Gods like Thor, with his hammer Mjolnir, were protectors of mankind. Odin, the one-eyed wanderer, sought knowledge in strange ways, like hanging from the world tree or trading an eye for wisdom. And let's not forget Loki, the trickster whose antics ranged from annoying to apocalyptic. But Christianity had been creeping in for a while. Monks brought it, kings enforced it, and silver, always silver, helped spread it. One of the first major figures to flip the spiritual switch was Harald Bluetooth of Denmark, the same Bluetooth from earlier. His rune stone doesn't whisper, it practically shouts. He made the Danes Christian. Now, was this out of spiritual awakening? Or a savvy political move to align with powerful Christian neighbors like the Holy Roman Empire? Historians still debate his motives, but either way, the shift had begun. In Norway, Olaf Tryggvason took the gospel even more seriously and more aggressively. Picture this: a Viking king stomping through the fjords with a Bible in one hand and a sword in the other. Conversion wasn't always peaceful. Olaf reportedly forced people into Christianity, smashing pagan idols and dunking holdouts in icy rivers, literally and spiritually. It's said he even chopped down Thor's sacred trees. That's one way to start a theological debate. And then there was Saint Olaf, or Olaf Haraldsson, another Christian king who tried to complete Norway's conversion. He died in battle at Stiklestad in 1030, but the locals later saw miracles at his grave. Canonized just a year later, Olaf became a saint and a symbol of Norway's new faith. Churches sprang up bearing his name, and his relics, because you couldn't be a proper saint without relics, were venerated across Scandinavia. Still, old beliefs didn't vanish overnight. In fact, for decades, maybe centuries, Christianity and Norse paganism existed side by side, sometimes even blending. Archaeologists have found graves with both Christian crosses and Thor's hammers. Some Vikings hedged their bets, pray to Christ on Sunday, toast to Odin on Thursday. It's like keeping a rabbit's foot in your church pew, just in case. And then there were the quiet rebels. Some communities, especially in Iceland and remote parts of Norway, resisted conversion for as long as they could. Outdoor altars, secret rites, and storytelling kept the old gods alive. After all, oral tradition was the soul of Norse culture, and no priest could burn that. A quirky tidbit here: even after becoming Christian, some Norse folks buried their dead with grave goods, like combs or weapons. Not quite pagan, not quite Christian, just Norse. Identity doesn't change with a single sermon. Back in the East, the Kievan Rusas converted in 988 CE under Prince Vladimir the Great. And how did he decide which religion to adopt? According to one version, he held a kind of spiritual beauty pageant, inviting emissaries from Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. In the end, he chose Byzantine Orthodoxy, possibly impressed by the dazzling churches of Constantinople. The mass baptism of Kiev marked a turning point, not just for the Rus, but for future Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. Meanwhile, the Norse who had served in the Byzantine Varangian Guard, those towering, axe-wielding warriors, began to absorb Eastern Christian traditions. Some even returned home with Greek icons or stories of Constantinople's gold-covered churches. One can imagine the confusion at the hearth when a Viking came home from Byzantium saying, "You won't believe what their candles are made of." Still, the symbolic end of the Viking Age wouldn't come with a sermon or a cathedral. It would come with a battle, far from Scandinavia, at a quiet river in northern England, Stamford Bridge, 1066. Not a grand fortress, just a crossing point. But on that September day, it became the graveyard of a dream. Harald Hardrada, the last great Viking king, sailed from Norway with ambitions to claim the English throne. He brought thousands of warriors, battle-hardened, loud and confident. They won an early victory but didn't count on Harold Godwinson, the English king, arriving with surprising speed. At Stamford Bridge, Hardrada was killed, and the Norse force shattered. The age of Viking invasions, those daring sea raids, was over. In fact, some say this battle marks the end of the Viking Age itself. Oh, and by the way, just 3 weeks later, Harold Godwinson would fall to William the Conqueror, Duke of Normandy. Yes, descendant of Norsemen who had settled in France. So in a twist of historical poetry, the final Viking victory came not from the sea, but through the land they'd once raided. What came after was assimilation. Norse culture blended into the Christian kingdoms of Europe. Their ships were still built, but for trade. Their gods still echoed, but in stories. And their descendants became lords, farmers, merchants, even monks. The Viking Age faded, not with collapse but with transformation. And maybe, just maybe, that's a greater legacy than 1,000 plundered towns. So here we are. The Viking Age has passed its peak. The gods are growing quiet, the raids are fewer, and longships are more likely to carry wheat and wool than warriors. But before the sails vanish completely from the northern horizon, let's take a closer look at what day-to-day life really looked like for the people who made the Viking world more than just swords and sagas. Let's start with the social ladder. At the top were the jarls, powerful nobles who owned land, led men into battle, and often held sway over entire regions. Think of them as a mix between warlords and governors, with the occasional poetic side hustle. Below them were the bondi, free farmers and landowners who made up the backbone of society. They weren't kings, but they had rights, responsibilities, and pride. A good bondi might own a ship, serve in battle, and debate laws at the local assembly. At the bottom rung were the thralls, enslaved individuals, often captured during raids or born into bondage. They worked the farms, built the longhouses, and did much of the hard labor. Some could eventually buy their freedom, but most lived tough, invisible lives. It's a sobering reminder that even in societies famed for independence, freedom had its limits. Now, when we say Viking, we often picture men with axes and epic beards. But women, they held surprising power and agency, especially compared to other medieval cultures. Norse women ran households, managed farms, and could inherit property. A woman who carried a ring of keys, literally attached to her belt, was often the head of a household. Keys weren't just practical, they were a symbol of status and control, and in death, that status continued. Some female graves, like the Oseberg ship burial, reveal a life of wealth and importance. The Oseberg woman was buried in a richly decorated ship, with wagons, textiles, animals, and possibly even a sacrifice servant. Was she a queen? A seeress? Historians still debate her identity, but clearly she was someone powerful. Speaking of homes, the typical Viking lived in a longhouse, a timber or turf structure with a central hearth and thatched roof. These weren't palaces, but they were warm, functional, and often housed extended families along with animals. Picture smoky rafters, carved wooden beams, and the soft clink of iron tools on bone-handled knives. At night, people huddled near the fire, telling tales or repairing gear. Privacy was limited, but community was strong. Across the North Atlantic, longhouses took root even in far-flung settlements like Shetland, Orkney, and Iceland. In these windswept outposts, the architecture adapted to the landscape. Thicker walls, more turf, and sometimes entire farms nestled in low protected valleys. Iceland, in particular, became a cultural sanctuary, preserving stories and traditions long after they faded elsewhere. Then there were the towns, like Birka in Sweden or Hedeby in Denmark, bustling centres of trade where Norse and foreign merchants mingled. These towns were often protected by ramparts or walls, with rows of wooden buildings along muddy streets. Markets buzzed with activity: spices from the east, silver from the Caliphate, furs from the Arctic, and glass beads from far-off lands. One quirky find from Hedeby: a tiny Buddha statue, likely brought through the vast trade routes that connected Scandinavia with Asia. Yes, a Viking-owned Buddha. Multiculturalism, Viking style. In these towns, craftsmen worked metal, leather, and wood with precision. Blacksmiths forged intricate brooches, blades, and tools. Weavers dyed and spun wool into vibrant textiles: reds, yellows, and deep indigo blues. Viking fashion wasn't just rough wool cloaks and fur boots. There were embroidered tunics, silver-fastened belts, and eye-catching jewelry. Forget Hollywood's drab Viking palette. They dressed with flair. Community life also revolved around assemblies, or things. These weren't just town halls. They were outdoor parliaments where free men gathered to make laws, settle disputes, and elect leaders. Iceland's Althing, established in 930 CE, is considered one of the oldest parliamentary institutions in the world. It met annually at Thingvellir, where lava fields meet high cliffs and icy rivers. Nature, politics, and tradition all wrapped into one dramatic backdrop. But let's not romanticize too much. Life was hard. Winters were brutal. Crops failed. Disease spread. A bad storm could mean the difference between a full larder and hunger. And not everyone had a ship or a sword or a saga written about them. Most people were just trying to get through the day, tending sheep, brewing mead, patching roofs, and hoping their children survived the cold. Even so, the Norse were never just survivalists. They were builders, lawmakers, artists, and dreamers. They carved rune stones to remember loved ones. They told stories of gods and giants around firelight. And they stitched together lives from sea, soil, and snow. Back to Iceland for a moment, because it deserves the spotlight. Isolated by geography but rich in imagination, this island became a haven for Norse identity. It preserved the sagas, those dramatic prose tales filled with honor feuds, cursed rings, and ghostly dreams. Written down in the 13th century, but based on older oral traditions, these sagas are part history, part soap opera, and fully captivating. One scholar called them the great novels of the Middle Ages, and he wasn't wrong. Iceland also gave us something rare: a literate culture in a mostly oral world. They wrote things down, not just poems and myths, but laws, genealogies, and even weather records. So if you're ever in a trivia contest and someone asks where to find the oldest continuous democratic record in the world, Iceland's Althing might just earn you the win. So here, in farms and forts, on assembly fields and snowy hillsides, Viking life persisted. Not with drama, but with quiet determination. Their strength wasn't just in battle, but in the daily rhythm of survival, creation, and connection. As the Viking Age waned, the kingdoms of the North Sea began to rise, reshaping the landscape politically and culturally. No longer were the Norse just roving raiders or isolated farmers. They were ambitious rulers carving out states that would lay the foundation for modern Scandinavia and beyond. The first great unifier was Harald Fairhair, credited with bringing much of Norway under one crown. According to saga tradition, Harald vowed not to cut his hair until he had united the petty kingdoms of Norway, hence the nickname Fairhair once he succeeded. Whether the hair tale is fact or fancy, Harald's reign around the late 9th and early 10th centuries marks a turning point from fragmented chiefdoms to a centralized monarchy. Of course, historians still debate how centralized or stable his rule truly was, but his legacy looms large. Denmark's most famous king in this era was Svein Forkbeard, a shrewd and relentless warrior who managed to conquer parts of England by the early 11th century. Svein's son, Canute the Great, took this further, ruling a North Sea empire stretching from Denmark and Norway to England. Canute's reign, around 1016 to 1035, was marked by diplomacy, lawmaking, and consolidation, a far cry from the chaotic raiding days. Canute even earned a reputation for prudence and piety, allegedly trying to command the tide to prove his power. Spoiler, the tide didn't listen. It's a vivid reminder that even great kings can look a little foolish when they mix hubris with natural forces. This story is often told as a lesson in humility, whether or not it actually happened. Meanwhile, to the east, new dynasties emerged from the Viking Rus world. The Rurikids founded what would become the powerful Kievan Rusas, a federation that thrived on river trade routes linking Scandinavia with the Byzantine Empire and the Muslim world. These rulers, descendants of Viking warriors turned princes, helped establish cities like Novgorod and Kiev, blending Norse, Slavic, and Byzantine cultures. Historians still puzzle over exactly how much Viking blood flowed through these rulers versus local Slavs, but there's no doubt the Norse influence was significant. Even in Poland, Viking connections left their mark. Archaeological finds at the Bodzia graves reveal Norse-style weaponry, jewelry, and burial customs. These Viking Polish nobles hint at a fascinating web of alliances and cultural exchange, proving the Vikings were not just invaders, but also settlers and intermarried aristocrats. The rise of these kingdoms involved building new kinds of power structures. Fortresses replaced isolated farms, coinage spread alongside barter, and written laws began to codify society. Christianity, as we touched on before, was often the glue binding these new realms, lending legitimacy to kings and connecting them to the wider European world. One quirky detail: despite being famed warriors, Vikings weren't obsessed with physical punishment. Instead, many Norse laws focused on fines and compensation, a system called vergild. Hurt someone's shield? Pay the shield's value in silver. Kill someone? That's a hefty sum. This approach helped reduce blood feuds, though helped is relative, considering the occasional axe to the head still happened. The political rise of the North Sea kingdoms also reshaped identity. Viking raiders became rulers, traders became diplomats, and local customs blended with imported ideas. Over time, the term Viking itself became more of a descriptor for activity than ethnicity. Going Viking was to raid or travel overseas, not necessarily a label for a specific people. This transformation is fascinating because it shows how cultures evolve, not just through conquest, but through governance, trade, marriage, and lawmaking. The Vikings' shift from raiders to rulers laid the groundwork for modern Scandinavia and influenced the British Isles and Eastern Europe. But even as kingdoms rose, the Viking spirit of exploration hadn't completely faded. New voyages led to the discovery of Greenland and Vinland, places that stretch the imagination as much as the sagas do. These Western ventures remind us that the Norse were not just warriors or kings, but also adventurers, navigators, and settlers chasing horizons. So, kingdoms rose and empires formed. But the Viking legacy was more than swords and shields. It was the shaping of nations, cultures, and identities that ripple through history to this day. The thunder of axes and the roar of longships have quieted, yet the Viking spirit didn't vanish in a single clash or a neatly dated moment. Instead, it seeped into Europe's courts, churches, and even its armies, mutating in surprising ways. If the Battle of Stamford Bridge marked the last great Viking landing in England, then the Norman conquest and the rise of the Varangian Guard show how their legacy was reborn. First, let's sail across the Channel. In 1066, William the Conqueror, himself a descendant of Rollo's Vikings, crossed from Normandy not in dragon-headed ships, but in a fleet bearing knights in chainmail. The Battle of Hastings may have ended Anglo-Saxon rule, but it also cemented Norse bloodlines at the heart of English royalty. William's court spoke Old French, worshipped in Latin-style cathedrals, and kept the Norman feudal system, yet beneath the gilded helmets lay genes shaped by fjords and longships. Historians still debate exactly how much Norman administration owed its efficiency to Norse organisational habits, but some argue you can trace county boundaries back to Viking settlement patterns. In that sense, the old raiders quietly became the architects of a nation. Meanwhile, far to the east, another Viking afterlife was unfolding. Beginning in the late 10th century and continuing through the 11th and 12th, the Byzantine Empire opened its golden gates to Norse warriors as part of the famous Varangian Guard. These hulking axes wielders served as the emperor's personal bodyguards, stationed in Constantinople's marble halls. They weren't just muscle. Some rose to high office, married Byzantine nobles, and blended Norse names with Greek titles. Scholars still argue how seamlessly these men integrated, but the archaeological record, from runic inscriptions in Hagia Sophia to sagas recounting imperial intrigue, speaks of a cultural fusion that endured for centuries. Imagine a Jarl's son once chasing villagers in Sweden, now ducking chariot wheels in the hippodrome and sipping wine sweetened with eastern honey. Back in Scandinavia, the old pagan rites faded into whispers. Runestones continued to be carved, but they increasingly bore crosses alongside dragon motifs. Farmers might plant their fields using a prayer to Freya, good harvest, before blessing the soil with holy water. Some remote valleys held onto secret rites well into the 12th century, yet generations raised in church schools knew their heritage through sagas, the great prose epics written in Iceland around 1200 CE. These sagas preserved stories of Njal's legal feuds, Egil's poetic rage, and Eric the Red's stubborn exile, blurring history and myth. Even today, academics still debate how accurately these texts reflect 9th and 10th century beliefs versus being coloured by Christian scribes. But they ensured that Viking deeds would echo through time, long after shields had rusted. And of course, the western reaches of the Atlantic weren't forgotten. Norse settlers in Greenland held out until the 15th century, eking out lives on the edge of ice. Their farms vanished into tundra, and their churches fell silent, yet their place names, like Brattahlid and Valsey, still dot the maps. Meanwhile, the fleeting settlements in Vinland, modern Newfoundland, left scant archaeological traces, fueling debate over how far and how long the Vikings explored North America. Scientists, professors, and archaeologists still argue whether those grass-roofed dwellings were seasonal camps or early attempts at colonization. Either way, the Viking wanderlust carried beyond known horizons, haunting Atlantic fogs long after the last man rode back to Europe. Within Europe's kingdom halls, Norse blood mingled with Frankish and Anglo-Saxon lines. The name Norman itself, Northmen, remained a living memory of Scandinavian roots. Even today, surnames like Bruce or Mowbray trace back to those Norman settlers. And English dialects bear Norse words in everyday speech. Leg, law, anger, and window all sail back to Old Norse vocabulary. The Viking legacy also survived in place names across Britain and Ireland. Anything ending in by, Derby, Whitby, or Thorpe, Scunthorpe, likely started as a Norse settlement. In Normandy, towns like Dieppe and Harfleur grew on former Viking trading posts. These linguistic footprints form an underwater reef beneath modern Europe, unseen at first glance, but shaping currents of culture and identity. By the mid-12th century, Norse identities had mostly folded into Christian polities. The last temple at Uppsala in Sweden closed, and the last known animal sacrifice was probably more symbolic than literal. The twilight of the gods arrived not in a blaze of glory, but in gentle hushes, the smoke from burning idols replaced by church candles, the clash of axes by church bells. Yet the memory of those gods endured in poetry, rites, and names. Thursday remained Thor's Day, Friday, Frigg's Day, and in the cold winds that rattled window panes across Scandinavia, one could still imagine the echo of a hammer strike. So, as you drift deeper into the soft murmur of sleep, picture this final scene: an abandoned ship grave on a grassy hill, its timbers bleached by sun and rain. A single raven alights on the prow, cawing once, then lifting off into the pastel dawn. The ship's journey is over, but its tale sails on. The final echoes of the Viking Age aren't found in grave mounds or runestones, but in the everyday rhythms of our modern world. Everywhere you look, language, literature, place names, and even sports, you're hearing the distant call of those sea wolves. Let's trace these ripples as they lap against the shores of today. First, language. Look around your home or on your smartphone. Words like window, from Old Norse vindauga, windai, knife, knifer, sky, ski, cloud, and berserk, from berserk, bear shirt, are so baked into English that you almost forget they crossed the North Sea a millennium ago. That's a concrete historical fact. Studies estimate that roughly 2 to 5% of basic English vocabulary derives from Old Norse loanwords, a legacy of settlement in the Danelaw and intermarriage between Norse and Anglo-Saxon communities. Scientists still argue whether these words spread primarily through conquest or through peaceable trade and daily contact. But either way, the Norse tongue gave us more than just skål at your local bar. Next, place names. If you live near a town ending in by, Derby, Grimsby, Thorpe, Scunthorpe, or Thwaite, Satterthwaite, you're standing on ground once owned or farmed by Vikings. In Normandy, villages like Harfleur, Army's Harbour, and Dieppe, Deep Water, preserve the Old Norse descriptors of landscape. Even in the United States, immigrants carried names like Ericsson, Harstad, and Bjornsson to the New World, stamping American towns with Scandinavian heritage. Historians debate how much these place name patterns reflect actual settlement density versus administrative naming by later scribes, but their persistence is undeniable. The literary echoes are vibrant too. The sagas written in medieval Iceland, tales of Egil, Njal, and the travels to Vinland, sparked the imaginations of Victorian and 20th century writers. J.R.R. Tolkien borrowed dwarven names from the Poetic Edda, and modern fantasy worlds owe a debt to Norse mythic structures. Academics still argue whether Tolkien was recycling scholarly translations or channeling genuine oral traditions. But fans know that Middle-earth's high-stakes quests feel oddly like a Vikings saga retold. On museum walls, replica weapons and helmets remind us of real warriors. But in popular culture, the Vikings often straddle myth and history. Fringe theories about Norse cosmology, like the idea that Viking navigators used sunstones to locate the sun on cloudy days, remain debated among scientists and professors in scattered journal articles. Whether magnetic crystals truly guided these mariners, or it's just a romantic notion under experiment, is a debate that sails on. Perhaps the most surprising echo is in sports. The Minnesota Vikings. Established in 1961, their horned helmet logo and purple jerseys tap into that rugged Scandinavian legacy. Fans chant "Skål," a modern adoption of the Old Norse toast skal, before kickoff. It's both homage and marketing, a playful nod to a cultural identity transplanted halfway around the globe. Quirky tidbit: the team's fight song once included bagpipes, a slightly misplaced Celtic flourish, but it stuck as part of the lore. Scholars might debate whether this counts as genuine cultural preservation or just good branding, but when 70,000 people stand and yell "Skål" under a frigid Minnesota sky, the ancient spirit of communal celebration is undeniably alive. Then there's tourism. In Iceland, guided tours of the Golden Circle include stops at Thingvellir, where the Althing still convenes in a symbolic ceremony. In Norway, coastal drives follow the North Sea Viking route, tracing longship paths past fjordside villages. Each summer, reenactors in Hedeby or Jorvik festival grounds row clinker boats and demonstrate sword techniques. Tourists pay to learn how to throw a javelin or plait wool garments, eager to touch a human-sized piece of history. Academics argue whether these living history events romanticize or educate, but both sides agree they keep Viking heritage in living memory. Even secular celebrations have Norse undertones. The modern pagan and asatru movements revive old rituals, blots by forest groves, naming ceremonies with runes, even reconstructed feasts with mead and roast boar. These groups insist they're restoring ancestral practices rather than inventing new ones. Historians and anthropologists still debate the extent to which such revivals reflect authentic medieval rites or modern spiritual innovation. But the fact that people seek connection to demons and deities long gone shows the depth of Viking resonance. And in our collective imagination, the Vikings remain both heroes and anti-heroes. Television series, video games, and comics reboot sagas with sympathetic yet flawed protagonists, often struggling with faith, family, and fate. Researchers discuss whether these portrayals honor the historical record or oversimplify it for drama. Yet viewers worldwide binge these stories, captivated by the blend of rugged landscapes, moral ambiguity, and thunderous soundtrack. All of this shows that the Viking Age never truly ended. It simply transformed. The raiders became traders, kings became national founders, and myths became the scaffolding for modern identities. From the names on our streets to the cheers in a stadium, the Vikings still whisper in our ears, inviting us to raise a glass and say, "Once more, Skål." Now let the pace soften further. Imagine a silent fjord at dawn, mist drifting like pale silk over glassy water. No horns, no clashing steel, only the gentle lapping of waves against a wooden hull. Feel the hush of centuries settle around you, as if the land itself exhales a long-forgotten breath. In this tranquil moment, the echoes of the past become a lullaby, each name and word a gentle ripple fading into calm. Remember the voyages and the sagas, but tuck them away like cherished pages in a leather-bound tome, held close to your heart. Picture the Norse fields where longhouses once stood, now grassy hollows under a vast, indifferent sky. The gods have gone quiet, and even the wind carries no demand for glory. Instead, it murmurs of homecomings, hearth fires, and rest. Let your thoughts drift to the hearth's glow, the aroma of peat smoke, the quiet company of family and kin. You are part of a story woven through time, one of wood, stone, and starlit crossings. And as your eyelids grow heavy, know that these tales are yours to carry, softly, into your dreams. So, sink into your bed as a longship settles at its mooring, secure after 1,000 nights at sea. Let the last words of history whisper you towards sleep, where past and present mingle in the gentle realm of imagination. Here, the saga ends, only to begin again in the quiet places of your mind.